Welcome to our study in Genesis. We're in week 16, and this week we're going to be looking at the story of the Tower of Babel. I'm going to try teaching one from home this week as we're going to be on the road, and hope that the class and those that study online with us will enjoy this. And so we're in the story of Babel, Genesis 10 and 11 this week, and would encourage you to read both those chapters, some of which we covered last week. The tail end of chapter 10, of course, or the beginning of 10, tail end of 9, when Noah and his descendants come off the ark, and then the three descendants of Ham, Shem, and Japheth, all of their descendants are listed. And we followed, of course, even last week, the story of Nimrod, the mighty hunter, and the various city centers that he established, which gave roots to both the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire. And we'll see more of that again today. So with our lesson that we should have received by now in the mail or email or posted on the website, let's have a look at this week's study. And our first question, it refers to our last lesson. It says that we learned that Ham was the youngest of Noah's three sons. We saw that in Genesis 9:24. Who is the oldest? And we find that in Genesis 10:21. And in Genesis 10:21, if you'll turn there, we read that, again, the descendants are being listed now, and it says in verse 21, also to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber, and the older brother of Japheth, children were born. Oh, the older brother of Japheth. So therefore, Shem was the oldest, Ham the youngest, and Japheth the middle child. And so now we have a little bit of a sense of family organization within Noah and his family. The next question that I ask is approximately how old do we think the Tower of Babel is? And that's an interesting question because it turns out that you'll get varying dates. We don't know where the Tower of Babel is exactly. We certainly think it's in Babylon, perhaps the city of Babylon, but we don't know that for a fact. So let's read for a moment the story of the Tower of Babel, which is in chapter 11. And we begin in verse 1, and it says, now the whole earth used the same language and the same words, the whole earth. So these would have been all the descendants of Noah's sons up until the Tower of Babel, which would have been a considerable population probably at that time. But it simply tells us anyone living on the earth spoke the same language and used the same vocabulary or used the same words. It came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. So they were traveling east from all the way back to wherever the ark had settled, probably hundreds, thousands of years ago. Who knows how long this has been. But from that they began to all migrate east, speaking the same language with the same vocabulary. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly, or in other words, let's bake bricks. And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. And they said, come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name. Otherwise we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they began to do. And now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. And so before we continue the story, consider for a minute that what we're seeing here is not, again, a Stone Age civilization of illiterate, stupid men who don't know how to communicate, dragging, their dead meat behind them that they hunted down that day, all that whole picture of sort of Neanderthal. These are intelligent people who know how to build. They know how to bake brick. They know how to use tartar for mortar. And they have moved into the city type of civilization, city-states, if you will, settlements that evolve into cities with baked brick and mortar. Well, this tells us that the Tower of Babel probably doesn't date back to much later than 35 or 3600 BC, perhaps as early as 3000 BC, because that's approximately the time when man sort of got the technology, learned the knowledge of how to bake clay to make bricks, use tar for mortar, and cities began to appear in civilization. As far back as, say, 12,000 years BC, man was pretty much a farming civilization. You'll recall, as we spoke of last week, Noah was a man of the soil, and so probably would have been his 3 sons. And so it's not unusual for us then to see, even through archaeology, that we have farming, agricultural kinds of settlements back 12,000 years ago. And then as time marches forward, those, of course, became nomadic, and one thing led to another, and the clans formed settlements formed cities, and then cities decided for their security they would build walls and so on. And all of that can be tracked fairly consistently through time. And so this probably tells us that the Tower of Babel was probably around 3500 BC or so. Well, isn't it interesting that God says they speak the same tongue, and they've now chosen this to do? And in fact, specifically, he said, the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And he said, behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they began to do. You could almost put a question mark in there. With all of their intelligence, the background of the flood, Noah, of course, we know these are descendants influenced by Nimrod and Cush and those guys. But with all of their knowledge, instead of turning to God, what they began to do is elevate themselves above God. And imagine in the day when this was happening, again, they were intelligent people, they were builders, they were organized, they probably felt as if they were, capable of doing anything. And if they weren't capable of doing anything, the knowledge was growing so fast that they would be capable of doing anything in a few years, that sort of thing. Even though to us, the way things sort of evolved over time, and 3,500 years ago, it seems like it took a long time, obviously, from one thing and another. But we know through archaeology that changes in ceramics, for instance, would occur in a 50 to 100 year period as man learned better skills at firing clay and sand and other things. So you had a civilization that was pretty confident in itself, and then the fact that they all spoke the same language, they had the same vocabulary, so you didn't have dialects and differences in language. They probably had the same economy, basically. Wow, does this remind us of perhaps today, where we are surrounded by technology? We do sort of speak a common language. Sherry and I travel a lot around the world. And English is fairly common as a second language in just about every country we've gone in. You can communicate in English even if you can't communicate in their language. And we're becoming, I think, a civilization more and more global each day, and more caught up in our own strengths and our own abilities. And cancer may be a challenge today, but with enough money and effort, man will be able to cure cancer tomorrow. And you just get the sense that through technology there just isn't anything we can't do. So let's elevate ourselves. Who needs God? Who needs God? We can be our own God. And I believe we're seeing that around us today, a very similar mentality to the Tower of Babel mentality. So we then read that God said, interestingly enough here, come, let us go down and there confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech. And of course the let us reference would be to God's Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Let us go down and confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because therefore the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. And so one of the things, too, that we see here is God had commanded Noah and his sons to not just populate the earth, but to go out over the earth, to cover the earth. And they hadn't. Everybody stayed together and sort of migrated together, if you will. And here we are now under the influence of Nimrod, Cush, and his descendants at Babel, the forerunner of Babylon, and of course the Assyrian and Babylonian empires, Assyria being based out of Nineveh, and then eventually, of course, the Babylonian Empire out of the city of Babylon. As we've said in a couple of different lessons, you go all the way back to the sons of Seth and the sons of Cain, and here we see what happens when we follow the sons of Cain. Bad leadership leads us in a bad direction, and we get that kind of leadership when we take our eyes off God. And I mean that as an individual and a country as well. We need to keep our relationship one-on-one with God first, and then trust in Him, and not our political strength, our military strength, our economic strength. When we begin trusting in those things, God gets pushed to the side. And so we also read here that God went down and sort of drove them out of the city, if you will, by confusing their languages, and they stopped building the city. And note that we do not see any reference here to God destroying the tower. So in theory, there is a tower out there to be discovered. The other sources, Josephus for one, tells us that in a fury God destroyed it. But nothing in the Bible tells us that. And certainly in the world of archaeology, the search continues for the Tower of Babel. Whether one will ever be discovered or not, we do not know. But in the Bible, specifically, it does not say God destroyed the tower. It says he scattered the people. And so back to our questions for today. Question 4, what was the primary source of sin for those living on the plain of Shinar? And of course it was their pride, as we've mentioned. The thought that they could do anything, that they had the capability of doing anything, they had the ability to do it, they had the resources, certainly they had the communication, language, and they were almost all of one accord in wanting to do it. So pride, individual and national, you might say, is really the core of the sin that brought them down and led them astray. In question 5, locate a meaning or definition for the root of the word Babili, or Babili, and its relation to the name of Babylon for the great city. And if you were able to find that, you'll see that it means the gate of God, and that Babylon itself referred to itself as the heavenly city. So we have the gate to God and the heavenly city incorporated within the city of Babylon, and that was certainly its attitude, that the ruler of Babylon was a god and was over the known empire at the time, over the known world at the time, and it certainly elevated itself above God without question. Now we get into some words. I want you to understand some words. What does the word glottogony, I can't even pronounce it right, I apologize, refer to? And it refers to the acquisition of the human ability to speak, communicate, to have a language, those sorts of things. And it associates this with evolution. This is it's a linguist's tie to evolution and how man evolved from grunting to eventually having a definable language. The difficulty, of course, with that is the problem we've had with evolution all along is it doesn't hold up under the Bible at all. And we see is all the way back with Adam and Eve. What did we see with Adam and Eve? They spoke with God. God spoke with them. And clearly there was a language all the way from the beginning with Adam and Eve. A man, in spite of what evolution would have you to believe, man didn't start out grunting and groaning and then eventually figured out how to speak. He had a language all along, and that language got scrambled or changed into many languages, confused, if you will, at the Tower of Babel. And then I ask you to look up the word etymology, and what does it refer to? And it's what we're doing here. It's the study of words. So in a language, you have the spoken word. Etymology is where did that word come from, whether it was written or spoken. How did that word evolve? And that's entomology. All of which tie to the confusion of the languages and trying to map where each nation, or each culture got its language from and the roots of it and so on. I've seen one article said you can trace all of the languages in the world to 72 sources, and those 72 you can trace back to Babel. I'm not a linguist. I honestly do not know. I do believe that all the languages of the world started with a single language in Babylon, at the Tower of Babel, in the city of Babel, and they got confused and spread from there across the mountains and the plains and the valleys and the oceans, the land bridges and so on. And we find in our languages today, which then have sort of evolved from those roots coming out of Babel. And then I asked the question for you, read Genesis 11:10 through 24, and what do you observe regarding the life expectancy of each succeeding generation following Noah? And if you read through all of that genealogy, of course, we all know that as time marched on post-flood, the lifespan of those recorded in the Bible became shorter dramatically over the span of just a few hundred years. And of course, as we spoke of last week, when you consider the changed environment that Noah found himself in, it's not a surprise that the life expectancy would have declined rapidly following the flood and the collapse of the vapor barrier over the original creation, and of course the destruction of the waterways and the ozone and the tilt of the earth and wind, snow, hail, all the weather effects that came in. All those things would have affected their lifespan along with their diet. So clearly what we see post-flood is a rapidly declining lifespan from the 600 to 900 years a person that we were seeing earlier in the Bible. When was Abraham born, and how old was he when Hagar gave birth to Ishmael? Genesis 11:27 and Genesis 16:15 and 16. There's a good question about when was Abraham born. There are two schools of thought. Primary, probably a few years back, would have been that Abraham was born around 2000, 2100, 1900 BC, somewhere in that range. Most would probably answer 2000 BC. But as time's gone on, and we're getting more and more evidence that probably Abraham was born around 1750, 1850 BC, somewhere in there. And then from reading the reference that I've given you, Genesis 16, 15, and 16, we know that he was 86 when Ishmael was born, as the first son, which of course he had with his handmaiden. And when we begin to study Abraham himself, which I believe is the following week's lesson, we'll get into more about Abraham, his family, his lifestyle, his mannerisms, his knowledge, what God thought of him, and so on. But for this week's lesson, Abraham was 86 when Ishmael is born, and Abraham was probably born somewhere around 1800 BC. And so with that, we'll close our study this week. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope the class has enjoyed the discussion they've had around it. I look forward to being back in class the following week. Thank you all.